When did you last hear your own voice, without the noise of who you were told to be? Or maybe a better question is, have you ever stopped being available to everyone, just to finally be available to yourself? Welcome to Mindful Footsteps, dear traveler. This is not just another video. This is a quiet invitation, a moment to return inward. As the Buddha said, you yourself, as much as anyone in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection, and yet many of us spend decades forgetting that. Here, we explore what it means to reclaim our peace, not by pushing the world away, but by coming home to what's always been within us. If you find a moment of stillness or truth in what you hear today, let it ripple outward. Like, comment, share this reflection, and if it feels right, subscribe to Mindful Footsteps, where every step is a return to self. Now, let us begin. Part 1. The illusion of constant availability. There is a subtle kind of suffering that wears no name. It doesn't come with broken bones or bruised hearts. It comes dressed as kindness. It sounds like a soft yes, whispered, even when your soul is quietly begging for rest. Have you ever noticed how quickly we respond to others, but how slowly we respond to ourselves? From childhood, many of us, especially those raised in cultures that prize obedience and service, are taught to equate goodness with availability. Be there, be helpful, be selfless. Don't cause trouble. Don't say no. Don't disappoint. But what happens when a lifetime of being there for everyone leaves you feeling like no one, not even yourself, is truly there for you? Who taught you that your value was tied to your usefulness? And more importantly, have you ever questioned that belief? In Buddhist practice, we are encouraged to observe our attachments. But attachments are not always obvious. They can hide behind roles: the caregiver, the reliable one, the peacemaker, the one who never says no. Yes, even the identity of being helpful can become a spiritual burden. As the Buddha taught, attachment is the root of suffering. And sometimes, just sometimes, we're not attached to others, but to the version of ourselves we think we must be in order to be loved. That version might be the mother who never says no, even when exhausted, the manager who answers every email within minutes, the friend who picks up every call, even when crying silently between conversations. But here's a truth many don't want to say out loud. Your value does not increase when you become more available to others. It increases when you become more available to yourself. Let me tell you a story. Years ago, I met an elderly woman in her 70s, a former corporate executive with a resume that could intimidate even the boldest minds in Silicon Valley. She had worked side by side with powerful names, including heads of state and billionaires you'd recognize instantly. Yet despite all her achievements, when I asked her what she regretted most, she didn't mention missed deals or failed ventures. She said softly, "I regret saying yes too much. I was needed everywhere, but present nowhere." Even in her most powerful moments, she had neglected the quiet voice within, the one that whispered, "Slow down, breathe, come home to yourself." How many of us are living this way, even now? Where in your life are you showing up from obligation instead of authenticity? And what would it look like to honor your own soul the way you honor others? Here's the paradox. The more we try to be everything for everyone, the more we lose the one thing that actually matters, ourselves. When your time, your energy, your emotional presence becomes currency to keep relationships afloat, then love becomes a transaction, not a connection. You become the ATM of emotional labor, the one who is always open, always ready, always depleted. This is not selflessness. This is self-forgetting. And no, this is not a call to abandon those you care for. It's an invitation to remember that compassion must include you. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever said yes when everything inside you was screaming no? Why did you say yes? Out of love? Or out of fear? Fear of being rejected, misunderstood, or seen as selfish? These are questions worth sitting with. They are not meant to judge, but to awaken. Because if we don't begin to question these patterns, we may wake up decades later asking what one of my students asked me recently. Have I lived a life of love or a life of fear disguised as service? When we speak of freedom in the Buddhist path, we are not only talking about liberation from suffering, we're talking about liberation from the roles that trap us, the identities we cling to, the invisible scripts we never consented to, but still perform day after day. Sometimes the most courageous spiritual act is not meditating for hours or traveling to a distant monastery. Sometimes it is this: to look someone in the eyes and say, with love and clarity, no, not this time. I choose peace. Let's turn inward together. If any of this resonates, let me invite you into a simple reflection. In what moments this week did I betray my own peace to meet someone else's expectations? Where have I confused being available with being valuable? And if you've ever had to reclaim your time, your energy, or your boundaries, repeat this to yourself or write it down. I choose to come home to myself. Next up in part 2, we'll explore what we unknowingly sacrifice every time we say yes too quickly, and how we begin to reclaim that sacred space. Part 2. The cost of always saying yes. There is a hidden cost to being endlessly agreeable. It begins quietly. A favor here, a small compromise there. You say yes not because you truly want to, but because it feels easier, safer, or more acceptable than saying no. Over time, this repeated act of self-abandonment becomes a pattern, and without even realizing it, you begin to disappear. You might still laugh, still serve, still show up, but inside, something sacred starts to fade. Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt like a stranger was looking back at you? Not because you've changed, but because somewhere along the way, you stopped choosing yourself. This is the cost of always saying yes. In Buddhist philosophy, this cycle is rooted in craving, called tanha, a thirst that doesn't always appear as desire for wealth or power. Sometimes it's the craving to be liked, to be needed, to avoid conflict, to maintain the illusion of peace. But peace built on self-neglect is not peace. It is performance. True peace requires honesty. And honesty often begins with a sacred, uncomfortable word: no. Let me tell you a story. I once spoke with a retired social worker, soft-spoken, kind-hearted, deeply respected in her community. She had spent 4 decades supporting others through crisis. When I asked her what she does now that she's retired, she smiled and said, "I'm learning how to be a beginner again, learning how to say no without guilt." She paused, then said something I will never forget. "I've spent my whole life pouring into others, but I never learned how to pour into myself. And this is what happens when saying yes becomes automatic. You stop reading the book that once moved your heart. You skip the morning walks that used to ground your soul. You forget the sound of your own breath." In one of the Zen teachings, A monk kept a cup of tea beside him each morning. He would fill it, sip it slowly, and by noon, whatever was left, he would pour out onto the ground. When asked why, he said, "I must not offer to others what I have not first savored myself." What a lesson! You cannot pour from an empty cup, but so many of us try, every single day. Why? Because we think we must, because we've confused being available with being lovable. But there is nothing loving about losing yourself. The Buddha once said, "If your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete." Let that sink in. Compassion is not about pleasing everyone. It is about honoring what is real. And sometimes what is real is this: you are tired. You need rest. You need space. You need silence. Not because you are weak, but because you are wise. How many times have you said yes just to avoid guilt? How often have you taken on more than you could handle just to keep the peace? And here is the deeper question. At what point does keeping the peace with others destroy the peace within yourself? Boundaries are not barriers. They are bridges back to your own well-being. I once sat with a man in his 60s who had spent decades caring for aging parents, raising children, and working long hours. When I asked him what brings him joy, he looked at the floor for a long time before saying, "I don't know anymore." Not, "I don't have time," not, "I don't deserve it," but, "I don't know." That is the cost. Saying yes all the time doesn't just empty your calendar, it empties your identity. This isn't about becoming selfish, it's about becoming sovereign. When you learn to pause, to check in with your body, your breath, your boundaries, you begin to reclaim the parts of yourself that were lost to approval, to fear, to guilt. You start choosing activities that restore your energy rather than deplete it. You learn to surround yourself with people who respect your time, not just consume it. And you begin to remember, your life is not a service menu for others. It is a sacred practice of being, breathing, and becoming. So take a moment and ask yourself, where in my life am I giving more than I have? Who am I trying to please at the cost of my own peace? And what would it feel like to say no, not out of anger, but out of love for myself? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Because the cost of always saying yes is not just burnout, it is the slow erosion of joy, the dulling of your spirit, the forgetting of your own name. And you, dear listener, were never meant to be forgotten. You were meant to remember again and again that your needs matter, your time is sacred, and your presence is a gift best given from a place of wholeness. Let this be the beginning of something quieter, truer, more spacious. Let this be the moment you stop apologizing for protecting your energy. Let this be the season where your yes becomes intentional, because it is no longer afraid to follow a wise and loving no. Part 3. The sacred power of withdrawal. In a world that never stops asking for more of you, stepping back can feel like rebellion. But in truth, it is an act of reverence for your own soul. Withdrawal, in the Buddhist tradition, is not about escape. It is not running away. It is returning to the one place we so often abandon, ourselves. There is a word we hold dear in monastic life: noble silence. Not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of fear, but the silence of clarity. A silence that listens, not just hears. A silence that reveals, not conceals. Have you ever felt the need to leave a room, not because of anger, but because your spirit knew it was time to return inward? That is noble withdrawal. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha teaches, Just as a solid rock is not shaken by the storm, so the wise are not moved by praise or blame. And how do we become that rock? Not by resisting life, but by learning when to step back from it. Not forever, but long enough to return to stillness. Let me share a story. There was once an old monk who lived on the edge of a bustling village. He rarely spoke, rarely joined the marketplace noise. People said he was distant, perhaps even unfriendly. But those who visited him discovered something unexpected, a presence so steady, so peaceful, it made the loudest minds grow quiet. One day, a traveler asked the monk why he kept so much to himself. The monk replied, "The louder the world gets, the more I must listen within." That sentence carries a kind of sacred weight, doesn't it? Because deep down, we know it is only in the pause that we begin to see clearly. But so many of us are afraid to pause, afraid that if we stop showing up, the world will move on, afraid that our silence will be misinterpreted, afraid that rest means weakness. But hear this, with your heart, not just your ears. Withdrawal is not weakness, it is wisdom. The world teaches urgency, but the soul teaches rhythm. And sometimes the soul's rhythm says, wait, step back. Don't answer that call. Don't fill that space with noise. Don't explain yourself. Just breathe. This is not selfishness. This is sacred remembering. Because in the absence of constant doing, you begin to remember who you are without performance, without pleasing, without proving. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you sat in silence, not to escape, but to feel, to be fully present with the weight of your own thoughts, your own body, your own breath? So few of us allow ourselves that space. We rush from one task to another, one screen to the next, one conversation to another. But silence has a language. And those who are brave enough to listen hear truth rise from within. That is why Buddhist monks retreat, not because they dislike the world, but because they know the world can drown the soul in noise if we're not careful. And perhaps you don't need a monastery. Perhaps your temple is your bedroom, your garden, your morning walk. Any space where your breath is more important than your notifications. It is in those quiet corners of life that you meet yourself again. And when you withdraw mindfully, something beautiful happens. You begin to see who truly honors your presence and who only valued your availability. That clarity can be painful, but it is also purifying. Because peace is not found in the approval of others. It is found in the relationship you build with stillness. Let me say this gently. You are not required to answer every message. You are not obligated to show up for everyone's urgency. You do not owe your energy to every situation that demands it. Your peace is precious, and anything that costs it deserves your pause, your consideration, your discernment. The Buddha once said, "A fool is known by their speech, the wise are known by their silence." So perhaps the next time you're drawn into a conversation that drains you or a situation that disturbs your balance, you might choose stillness instead of reaction, silence instead of defense, not as retreat, but as return. You are not here to fix every problem. You are not here to respond to every cry. You are not here to carry what was never yours. You are here to awaken. And awakening often begins in silence. So take the walk without your phone. Let the music stop for a while. Let the quiet become your teacher. In that space, your soul will rise, not with noise, but with truth. This is the sacred power of withdrawal, not turning away, but turning inward, not giving up, but giving in to presence, to breath, to peace. And that, dear listener, is a power greater than anything the world could ever demand from you. Part 4. Boundaries as an act of compassion. In spiritual practice, we often speak of compassion, but rarely do we include ourselves in that conversation. True compassion is not just how gently we treat others, it is also how gently we protect our own peace. Boundaries are often misunderstood. To many, they sound harsh, rigid, even unkind. But in Buddhist practice, boundaries are not walls. They are doors, doorways that protect what is sacred within, not to keep others out, but to make love sustainable. The Buddha taught the path of right speech and right action. These are not just ethical precepts, they are invitations to be honest, to speak from a place of clarity, to act from a place of awareness. And in that honesty, sometimes we must say, I cannot, not right now, not in this way. Boundaries, then, are not a rejection of others. They are a recognition of our capacity. They say, this is the shape of my peace. Please honor it. Let me ask you something. Have you ever said yes and felt a quiet resentment bloom inside you moments later? Have you ever stayed in a conversation too long, listened when your energy was depleted, gave when your heart was dry? That resentment, it is not a sign that you're a bad person. It is a sign that a boundary was needed and it was ignored. In Designing the Mind, the author speaks of self-alignment as the cornerstone of well-being. And what is alignment if not living in a way that matches our inner truth? Boundaries are the outer form of that inner truth. Shambhala teachings remind us, a compassionate warrior is someone who knows how to hold both strength and tenderness, to say no when it is needed, even when it is uncomfortable, to speak truthfully, not from anger, but from presence. There's a story from the life of the Buddha. A man came to him, shouting insults and slurs. The Buddha remained calm. After the man was done, the Buddha gently asked him, if someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong? The man, stunned, said, to the giver. The Buddha smiled. Then so it is with your anger. This was not indifference. It was boundary. He did not take in what did not belong to him. And that is the essence of compassionate boundaries. We do not need to absorb everything. We do not need to say yes to every demand. We are not required to carry burdens that were never ours. Let me share a real story. I once met a woman named Clara, a retired midwife in her late 60s. She told me she had spent her entire life taking care of others, her patients, her children, her aging mother. She was proud of that life, but she had never once told her grown children no. Not once. One day, her son asked her for money, again. And this time, something inside her paused. She looked at him and said gently, not this time. I love you, but I need to take care of myself too. She told me later, I was afraid he'd pull away. But instead, he respected me more. For the first time, he saw me as a whole person, not just a source. Clara learned something that day, something many of us still struggle to believe. Love does not disappear when you set a boundary. In fact, real love begins there. Boundaries allow relationships to breathe. They teach others how to meet us with care. And most importantly, they remind us of our own worth, even when we are not giving, fixing, or pleasing. If your kindness always comes at the cost of your peace, it is no longer kindness, it is self-erasure. Let me ask you, where in your life are you saying yes, just to avoid discomfort? Where are you biting your tongue to maintain peace that is only on the surface? What would happen if you trusted that a boundary set in love is a doorway to deeper understanding? In Buddha Talking, there's a passage that says, "The mind that knows its limits is the mind that rests in peace." And isn't that what we all seek? Not more approval, not more tasks, but rest, peace, spaciousness, integrity. You are not unkind when you say, "This drains me." You are not selfish when you say, "I need space." You are not wrong when you say, "No." You are wise. You are listening. You are living in truth. Let this be your practice. Say yes when your heart feels light. Say no when your breath shortens and your body tightens. And say it all with love. Because love without boundaries is not love. It is fear wearing a mask of kindness. You do not need to justify your peace. You only need to honor it. And in doing so, you invite others to do the same. Part 5. Recognizing emotional manipulation. There is a kind of suffering that leaves no visible mark, yet lingers quietly in the heart. It is the pain of being emotionally used, subtly, softly, by those who say they love us. Emotional manipulation is rarely loud. It rarely comes with shouting or threats. Instead, it disguises itself in gentle tones. "I just need you. You're the only one who understands me. If you really cared, you would." On the surface, it may look like closeness, but underneath, it is control. In Buddhism, discernment, prajna, is one of our greatest allies. It helps us see clearly not just what is said, but what is behind it. What is the intention? Is this request coming from love, or from fear, from connection, or from dependency? When someone uses guilt to get your attention, or sadness to trap your kindness, it's no longer relationship, it's spiritual entanglement. And many of us, especially those with big hearts, fall into this cycle unknowingly. Because we've been taught to equate love with sacrifice. We think, if I don't help them, who will? But the Buddha reminds us, a person who carries others but forgets themselves is not yet free. Let me share a real story. I once counseled a retired nurse in her early 70s. For decades, she had been the emotional anchor of her family. Whenever someone needed rescuing, financially, emotionally, logistically, they came to her, and she never said no. Until one day, she didn't answer the phone, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. Her daughter sent a message. "Why are you being so distant? I thought we were close." She sat with that message for hours, and then she replied, "I'm not distant. I'm finally listening to the part of me I've ignored for too long." That was the beginning of her healing. Emotional manipulation is often not intentional. It can come from people who are themselves wounded, unaware of their patterns. But that doesn't make it less damaging. As Shambhala teachings say, compassion without wisdom becomes enabling. Wisdom without compassion becomes cold. We must find the middle path. To care deeply, yes, but to also see clearly. Manipulators often thrive in environments where silence is mistaken for peace and compliance is mistaken for love. They do not need to demand, only to hint. And when you finally say no, they may shift into sadness or blame. Not because you hurt them, but because you broke the cycle they depended on. You are not here to be a tool for someone else's avoidance. You are not here to be the emotional sponge for someone else's storms. You are here to awaken. And awakening includes recognizing when a dynamic no longer supports growth for either of you. If a relationship cannot survive your honesty, your boundaries, or your rest, it is not love. it is dependency. So let me ask you, have you ever felt obligated to say yes, not because you wanted to, but because you feared the emotional consequence of saying no? Have you ever stayed in a connection where guilt was the glue? These are signs worth honoring, not with anger, but with awareness. And from that awareness, we respond, not by lashing out, but by stepping back. The Buddha taught that freedom begins where clinging ends. You can care without being controlled. You can love without losing yourself. Your presence is sacred, and it must not be negotiated through guilt. When someone truly loves you, they will respect your no. They will not weaponize their emotions to bend your will. They will not make their discomfort your responsibility. So let this be your gentle reminder. You are not cold for protecting your energy. You are not heartless for stepping away from manipulation. You are not selfish for saying, "I will no longer carry what was never mine." This is not disconnection. It is liberation. And in that space where fear once lived, real connection, rooted in honesty, clarity, and mutual care, can finally grow. Part 6. Choosing silence over reaction. In moments of tension, when voices rise and hearts beat faster, silence can feel unnatural, even threatening. We're taught to defend ourselves, to correct misunderstandings, to speak quickly so we aren't misunderstood. But in Buddhist practice, we are offered a different path, one rooted in equanimity. Equanimity is the calm mind amidst the storm. It is not indifference. It is presence, without panic. To pause, to remain still, to breathe. This is not weakness. It is wisdom in motion. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." And sometimes, that one word is no word at all. Silence, when chosen with awareness, becomes a sacred space. It gives us room to feel instead of react, to reflect instead of defend, to return to our center before engaging with the world again. Have you ever regretted something you said in anger? But have you ever regretted a moment of silence used to listen, to breathe, to steady yourself? There is a Zen story of a young monk who was insulted by another. He asked the master, "Should I defend myself?" The master replied, "When someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does it belong?" The monk understood. Just because something is thrown at you doesn't mean you have to catch it. This is the power of silence. When we stop reacting to every trigger, we begin to reclaim our inner authority. We become less predictable, less controllable, not cold, but deeply centered. And in that space, transformation happens. So the next time a storm comes, pause. Not to suppress, but to soften. Not to run, but to rise. Because silence, when rooted in clarity, is not the absence of strength, it is the highest form of it. Part 7. The loneliness that leads to liberation. Loneliness is often feared, yet in the Buddhist path, it can be a doorway to deep transformation. What we call solitude is not a void, it is a space of quiet truth. When we step away from constant interaction, from the need to be seen or needed, something sacred begins to unfold. In Buddhism, this is known as noble solitude, a time when we face ourselves not with judgment, but with compassion. In the absence of noise, we begin to hear the voice we've ignored, our own. Many people fear this silence, believing it means disconnection. But true solitude is not disconnection. It is reconnection with who we are beyond roles, titles, or expectations. It is here, in this stillness, that we realize we are already whole. We are not missing anything. We were simply too distracted to notice. To sit alone with presence is to return home. Part 8. Emotional sovereignty. After 60, with age comes clarity. And with clarity comes the realization that peace must no longer depend on others. Emotional sovereignty means reclaiming ownership of how we feel, no longer letting someone's mood, words, or absence shake our center. Buddhism teaches that true freedom begins when we stop clinging to external validation and return to the stillness within. After 60, this is no longer a luxury, it is a necessity. You've spent decades tending to others. Now is the time to tend to your own spirit. You are allowed to protect your joy, to step back from chaos, to choose silence over explanation. Emotional sovereignty is not coldness, it is wisdom. It means you no longer give away your peace in exchange for approval. And from this space of calm, you respond, not react, live, not perform. You finally become the source of your own steadiness. Conclusion: returning to your inner temple. At some point in life, often after 60, we begin to sense a quiet invitation to stop chasing, to stop explaining, to stop giving ourselves away in fragments, and instead to return, not to a place, but to a presence, your own. The path to inner peace is not paved by doing more. It is revealed by releasing what never truly belonged to you, the need to be everything to everyone, the fear of saying no, the craving to be needed in order to feel worthy. As we shed those layers, what remains is something far more sacred, the self that has always been there, whole, wise, and waiting. By practicing non-attachment, we loosen the grip of old identities. By setting compassionate boundaries, we protect what is sacred within. And by embracing emotional sovereignty, we finally stand in peace, not as a performance, but as a presence. This is your inner temple, not built of stone, but of stillness, not owned by anyone, but honored by you. So I leave you with this. What would your life feel like if you no longer betrayed your peace to preserve someone else's comfort? Let today be the beginning of that answer. Let today be your return. And if this message has touched a quiet place within you, let it echo. Comment below with the words, "I choose peace." Share this reflection with someone who needs it. And subscribe to Mindful Footsteps, where each word is a step back home. May you walk gently. May you walk free. May your footsteps always lead inward,